interesting and overlooked and underappreciated financial tools I've ever seen.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Rhaegar with Plan Scout. We have a special guest, Brady Mullen, who specializes in helping financial professionals navigate reverse mortgages. You can model any type of asset, income, and taxability of those in our planning software. And so today, we're going to start with a little bit of background about reverse mortgages, understanding how they might work, how they might help certain types of clients, and then we're actually going to show you how to model them in the software, and John Michael's going to take us through that. So with that, Brady, why don't I pass it over to you?
Sure. Thanks, Rhaegar. Thanks, John Michael. So my background, I was a financial advisor and accountant. We had a small firm in the Denver, Colorado area. I did that for 19 years. I sold my practice in 2021 for a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is I started recognizing as my kids were becoming adults that the real estate related choices that they make and that you have to make because you need shelter, right? You can't opt out of real estate related choices. And sometimes people feel like renting, for example, is opting out of real estate related choices, and it clearly isn't, right? You're giving a landlord tens of thousands of dollars a year. Like, these are some of the biggest financial decisions that people make. And due to my role in my financial practice, we were an independent financial planning firm, but it was very difficult to navigate the friction in the financial planning world and talk about the financial impact of real estate related choices. And one of the things that really stuck with me when I learned about how reverse mortgages work, I thought this is one of the most interesting and overlooked and underappreciated financial tools I've ever seen. And that was a big part of me wanting to spread the word and help people understand how this works, how it plays into a long-term financial plan. So that's my background. I wasn't bred in the mortgage industry to sell mortgages. I really just think this is an underappreciated financial tool that could help millions of people that don't know that it's right under their noses. So I'll start with just explaining high concept ideas, and then we'll get into the details of actually how it works. It's an FHA loan, so there's very clear instructions on here's how it works, here's what can be done, here's how you can use it. And then we'll get into those details.
That's great. I'm excited. Let's jump in.
Okay, that's a little about my background. Here's some books that I wrote about the topic. They became bestsellers, which I'm kind of grateful for. And I'm not saying this to brag about that. I'm just saying that there's clearly a demand for people wanting to know about how their home ownership blends into their overall financial plan, because it's something that is largely and unfortunately not integrated into the financial planning process in most cases, which is too bad because we know that it has big financial planning implications. Another thing that usually start this conversation with is just this simple question: what color are yield signs? And most people answer that question saying yellow. There's a few people that don't say that. Most people say yellow, but the truth is that they're red, and they have been since the late 1970s. And I only bring that up to point out that our brains do something naturally all the time, which is we solve problems and then consider it solved, and we trust our past selves to have solved it properly, and then we move on. And if that weren't true, if our brains didn't do that, I'd have to relearn how to drive my car every day. I'd have to relearn how to brush my teeth every day. Like, everything would have to be relearned, and we wouldn't make it past our homes. But in some cases, our intuitions get certain things wrong, and that's very true in the world of finance. In fact, this goes so far as to say I think in the world of finance, if the right decisions were always intuitive, we wouldn't need financial advisors. Like, financial advisors' best value is when the choice isn't obvious to the client and they can navigate the client through scenarios that may not be intuitive, but are the most tax efficient, the safest, the best risk adjusted return, all those kinds of things. Like, that's why people need advisors, is because they're going through a very nuanced field, and it's something that you don't get a second chance on. And there's a lot riding on it. It's somebody's future and their finances, and they want to make sure they get that right. So they hire advisors to sort of guide them through that process.
I completely agree. And if you even think 10 years ago, when robo-advisors, which now I think are called digital advice platforms, came to be, there was a big fear that why would clients come to them? Well, the reality is people like getting advice from other people, and it's not just math, and it's not just a calculator. That need for guidance is huge.
I mean, that's a good example. Like, if I'm perfectly comfortable having a robot vacuum my floors.
That's right.
I'm not comfortable getting into an airliner with no pilot up front, right? That makes me nervous. And it's not like machines can't help. I want that pilot to use technology, but I want there to be a human to recognize when it looks like, we're getting some bad data here. I need to take over. This isn't right. Right.
That's
I
right.
need a human overseeing that because the stakes are just too high. So one thing I want to point out, and I'm hoping many of the people watching this know of Dr. Wade Pfau. His title is the head of research at the American College of Financial Planning Services. And he writes a lot of books on financial planning, how to mitigate risk, how to plan for a successful retirement, how to use certain tools, when they apply, when they don't. And he wrote a book in 2015 about reverse mortgages, and this is the one that got my attention, that sort of floored me. It was this is one of those books where I read it and I thought, where has this been all my life? I remember thinking, like, this is the most interesting tool that I've never heard of. I mean, I'd heard of reverse mortgages, but I just had a very vague understanding of it. And this book really changed my thinking. And the book's interesting because he does talk about how they work. It's a great book for financially minded people. I highly recommend it. But he also is very clear in this book. There's this undercurrent in the book, which is something like, as a financial planning industry, we need to understand this, because all a reverse mortgage is it's a tool that makes your home equity liquid. It makes your home equity spendable. And sometimes when I say that to people, they say something like, "Well, I don't want to spend my equity," and I would think, well, that isn't really what I'm talking about. You certainly don't want it to be illiquid if you really had that choice. That's like saying, "I don't want to spend my savings account in the bank." That may be true, but that doesn't mean that you don't want it liquid in case you want to or need to someday in the future. You can't know that. Like, liquidity is, all else equal, liquidity is a very good thing. So, and a reverse mortgage is that it just makes the equity in your home liquid. That's all it's for. And we'll talk about how it does that, but that's the purpose of it. And because it's such a huge asset in people's portfolios, I mean, even if it's, for some people, it's smaller relative to their portfolios than others, of course, but it's very clear that the homes we live in have tremendous value. People pay a lot of money for homes, and yet it's sort of ignored in the financial planning context because it's a very clunky asset. It's really hard to use that asset in a financial planning context because it isn't liquid. If I need an extra $10,000 in a particular month, I cannot sell $10,000 worth of my equity to spend it, if we're talking about the equity in my home. Now, I could do that with a portfolio, with a stock portfolio. I could sell $10,000 and spend that. But the home equity is something that's illiquid, and putting a feature on that home equity that makes it usable. The way that it is made liquid is it's a line of credit. A lot of people don't know that that's how it's structured, but it is structured as a line of credit. We call it the home equity conversion mortgage. There's a few different kinds of reverse mortgages, but the one that makes up the vast majority of reverse mortgages is the FHA insured reverse mortgage, which is technically called the home equity conversion mortgage, or the HECM. It's structured as a line of credit. And when you think of that, what it's doing, so this is how it makes the home equity liquid. It allows you to borrow against it while keeping the asset rather than selling portions of it. What that does, by attaching the line of credit to the home, what you're doing is you're making it liquid, which does two things. It adds more resources to the overall pool. So think of all the clients who aren't certain that they have enough for retirement, which is basically almost everyone, right? Because certainty is such a high bar. Making the home equity liquid just in case has no downside. You're just making it liquid and spendable. You don't have to run up a balance. You don't actually have to use the line of credit, but having it there for access if you need it or if you want it could be tremendously helpful because it adds more resources to the pool. Another thing that it adds is more options. So when you need money in retirement, there's one more channel of places or one more source of places you could get the money from. It doesn't mean you have to use it. It's just one more area that can be used. And because a distribution from a reverse mortgage is tax-free, it comes in handy. Making it available for use is only a good thing. Because ultimately what's happening, and now unless you're living under a rock, you probably have heard negative things about reverse mortgages, and I attribute that to three things. And the first one we already talked about, which is that it's a line of credit, and that has two implications. One is that people don't know that it's a line of credit, but the other implication is that people aren't generally trained on how to strategize with lines of credit. And here's an example of what I mean by this. In some cases, we are financial planners say, my clients don't need a reverse mortgage because they have other assets. Of course, your clients have assets, but the real fundamental thing that is misunderstood when I hear them say that is that you don't need a line of credit if you have assets. And that isn't true about finance. Case in point, think of a big company like Microsoft, for example, an enormous company. Do you think that they have lines of credit set up with financial institutions all over the world? And the answer is, of course they do. And it isn't because they don't have wealth. They clearly have wealth. They clearly have assets. But lines of credit are extremely useful financial tools that wealthy people and businesses use all the time. But for whatever reason, using those as a strategic resource among households, it just hasn't made it out to that level of clientele for whatever reason. Now I've seen, I recommended this as a financial advisor too. Like if someone had equity in their home, I would often say, it makes sense to open a HELOC. You never know, right? You might want to use that if a storm comes financially and you need to access some wealth and you don't want to keep, $100,000 in the bank for a rainy day, and something comes up, you've got access to equity you can use, and you can always sort out the details later, but you've got something that you can use that isn't a credit card and doesn't require you to keep a bunch of cash in the bank. Lines of credit are useful for those and many other reasons, which is why wealthy families and businesses keep them on hand all the time.
This concept of taking a strategy that the ultra high net worth use and democratizing it so that the mass affluent can use it is a proven formula. For some of the newer products like direct index investing, where you're replicating indexes, these are things that ultra high net worth have done for a long time, but it's expensive because you need a lot of infrastructure. So it's exciting to see opportunities where some of these strategies that were only available to a select group of people because of their resources now available to everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point. We often take our lead from the people that have accountants and financial planners literally on staff. And one of the advantages that they have is that they're often less emotionally connected to the money. If their advisors and their accountants come together and say, hey, rather than selling this asset to acquire our competitor, we think borrowing the money instead makes more sense because there's maybe an arbitrage opportunity, or it's more tax friendly, or it doesn't require us to sell other assets and pay capital gains. Like those are the kinds of things that they use lines of credit for all the time. And it isn't because they're not wealthy. It's actually because they are wealthy that they know how to use these tools. The second point here, we've created an environment, a culture where social media is such a powerful influence in our culture, and it doesn't boost people who are accurate. It boosts people who are interesting. There's all sorts of, I call them financial influencers out there that have 500,000 followers, and they wouldn't have that many followers if they were wrong about everything, but that doesn't make them right about everything either. It just makes them interesting. They know how to build a brand. They know how to make interesting videos, but we've gotten into a culture where we're kind of left to our own devices. If I go to YouTube and search, hey, how do reverse mortgages work? YouTube has no way of understanding which videos are accurate or which videos aren't. They just know which videos are watched the most. So that's what they're going to fill up my queue with. But the good news is with reverse mortgages, it's an FHA loan. There's very clear black and white guidelines on here's how they work. Here's how your line of credit is determined. Here's how it grows over time, which we'll talk about. I mean, the good news is that this is a very highly regulated loan with very clear black and white guidelines where we can learn how it works without hoping that somebody on YouTube is going to interpret it for us. The reverse mortgage was signed into law by Congress in 1988. It's been under our noses for decades. Yeah, it's not new. It's morphed and it's changed over time because that's what happens with even the regular FHA loans for traditional mortgages. So I'm not saying it's the same product that it has been since '88, but it's been something that Congress has recognized from the financial thought leadership as something that should be accessible to seniors, and it's not new. But the reason that it's taken a long time for, I guess, for liftoff, so to speak, is because it creates an emotionally misleading process for people. It has a financial concept at its core that is emotionally misleading, which is in a phrase, it's using debt strategically, and people resist that, which is why the wealthy families, they're comfortable with that because they have teams of people guiding them through that, and they're less connected to their wealth because they hire people to help them with that. But for households, taking that on and that new concept when all they've heard their whole lives is that debt is just a bad thing is difficult for people. And that sometimes makes me think too, like how can you really think that debt is a bad thing when your home equity would not have been possible without the proper use of debt. There's like $35,000 trillion worth of home ownership equity. It's a huge, huge number. That's about the size of all retirement accounts in the country as well. It's such a huge number. And how much of that would have been possible without the use of debt somewhere along the way to get the ball rolling for a lot of these families? Like it's got to round to zero. Almost all of that had to have been, somehow instrumental, or debt was instrumental in almost all of that equity that's built up. So how can you categorically dismiss debt? It's a useful tool. It's not good or bad. There's bad versions of it. I don't want $80,000 of credit card debt at 20% or something like that. But I do want my home equity, and I couldn't afford to buy a house in my 20s all cash. I needed the debt, and it kept me from paying probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to a landlord in the meantime. Debt is a strategic thing.
Emotion is one of the biggest reasons why financial advisors are successful, those that use planning, because they're able to take the emotion out of it and actually just show the facts to help clients make better decisions.
I couldn't agree more. So here's that concept in a nutshell. Like it's a pretty simple idea. So let's say that there's a couple with a pension and 2 Social Securities, and they're still saving money in retirement. They're maybe 75 years old. I'm sure everybody listening, if you're in the financial planning space, you know people like this who have been saving for their whole lives, and they're retired and they're still saving because they're living on pensions and Social Security. Right? So let's say they have a $500,000 brokerage account somewhere that they probably just won't use. In fact, they're still saving into it maybe. But let's say they've got this $500,000 brokerage account somewhere, and the wife goes to the husband and says, "Honey, I want to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary, and I want to invite all of the children, all the grandchildren. This is important. We've got, that we've created this big family. I want to celebrate this, and I want to foot the bill." So let's say they make this big plan. They've got plane tickets, and they budget for this $50,000. So they peel out $50,000 out of their assets. They've got $450 left, and 10 years later, that $450, let's just assume that it doubles, right? That's not unreasonable. So 10 years later, it's $900,000. Now there's no question that they are $100,000 less wealthy 10 years from now than they would have been had they not gone on the trip. But it's obvious that they have $100,000 less money 10 years from now because they spent $50,000 on that trip 10 years ago. But you compare that to using a line of credit instead. Let's say instead of taking $50,000 out of this account, they borrow $50,000 instead on some line of credit where a payment isn't required. They're just allowed to let that accrue. This $500,000 10 years later becomes $1 million. There's that $100,000 difference because we didn't use that account. Well, if this line of credit also accumulates at 7.2%, now we owe 100. The net wealth is exactly the same. It's the same thing. Now, I'm not trying to smuggle in some idea where it's obvious that this number and this number are always going to be the same. In order for this to be true, for this to be 900 and this to be equal 900, this percentage and this percentage have to be the same. But if this is lower than what you're earning, that would be called arbitrage, and this would actually be better. If this were higher, then that would be negative arbitrage, and that would have been a bad strategy. The point in this slide isn't me saying that people should use a line of credit instead of selling assets. The point is that's a valid thing to do, and wealthy people do it all the time for 2 reasons. First, a lot of times wealthy people have their wealth in something that is either illiquid or perceived to be illiquid. So I think of like Elon Musk is a good example. If you just think about when he bought Twitter, could he have sold his Tesla stock to buy it? And the answer is he could have. Did he do that? No, he didn't. He borrowed the money for 2 reasons. Tesla, in his situation, Tesla isn't liquid to him. He wants to keep his ownership control, and the second reason is he doesn't want to pay the taxes. His capital gains on selling Tesla stock would be enormous.
Right.
And so for that reason, wealthy families use this because in this bottom strategy here, nothing taxable has happened. Whereas accessing this $50,000 in this scenario is a taxable event unless it's a Roth IRA, in which case I might even argue even harder for this strategy because you should probably leave the Roth IRA alone as long as possible because it's the most tax-friendly account that you have. Another scenario where this might not be taxable is if you're selling those assets at a loss, which again, I would make a similar argument, which is, well, don't sell the assets at a loss. You use some other asset instead. And if you really wanted to use these assets, let them recover and pay off the line of credit along the way after they've recovered. Don't sell them at a loss unless there's other strategic reasons to do that. So fundamentally speaking, selling assets and foregoing the future growth is, again, fundamentally the same thing as keeping the asset on your balance sheet and borrowing against it, only it's more tax efficient. There's a few different kinds of reverse mortgages, and we could spend hours talking about the nuances and differences between them. But luckily, just for the sake of simplicity, there's a reverse mortgage. It's the FHA insured variable home equity conversion mortgage. That's a mouthful, but we call it the variable HECM. It makes up like 96% of all reverse mortgages that are written. It's by far the most common solution. Now, again, there are times where other products are a better solution, but because this one is by far the most common, that's the one that I'm going to go into. And if some of its limitations cause a problem for someone, then we can use other products that have their own set of pros and cons, and sometimes those are a better fit. So first of all, I like to point out for anybody that's still not familiar with how this works, it's an FHA loan. It's created and administered by HUD. It's insured by FHA. The CFPB has their hands all over it because it's a financial tool that is also delivered to seniors, in which case they're considered a protected class by the federal government for these reasons, and for good reason, because they don't want them being targeted for fraud. So this is the most regulated loan that I know of.
Wow.
It's very highly regulated.